Hello, everybody. Thank you. We have the great privilege of keeping your attention for the last panel of the day. We will do our very, very best. And the theme is all about keeping the United States engaged in this effort. I think it is fair to say that at this stage of the war, there is only one way that Putin can win. And that is if we stop supporting Ukraine, we, the United States, and the European countries that have been partnering effectively with Ukraine thus far. The good news, I can say, as a recent member of the United States Congress, is that there is still strong bipartisan support for Ukraine in the body that provides all the money that we are talking about spending in Ukraine. But I want to stress this as clearly as possible. This cannot be taken for granted, not at a time when the likely presidential candidate of one of our two major political parties has philosophically more in common with President Putin than with President Zelensky. We will have a fight on our hands when the money that has currently been appropriated runs out. Now, I will say, again, quite bluntly, that the people in the United States Congress, in our political debate in the United States, who categorically oppose supporting Ukraine, do not give a damn about corruption in Ukraine. In fact, I suspect some of them might like to benefit from corruption in Ukraine if they had the opportunity. That said, they will use any example, any reported case of malfeasance or corruption in Ukraine as a pretext to cut off our support. So politically, this conversation is essential. Again, keep in mind the stakes. This is the only way Putin can win and Ukraine can lose if the bad guys win this debate in our capitals, particularly in Washington. Second point I would make, that's sort of the defensive argument for making sure that we get this right in Ukraine. There's also a positive argument from my point of view. I think the fight against corruption for good governance in Ukraine is part of the answer to the central question that policymakers in the West are asking about this war, and that is, how does it end and how do we win? We all agree Ukraine must win and Russia must be seen to have lost. And there are different definitions of that. One is based on the idea that this war is simply about sovereignty and territorial integrity. And if that's what you believe, then the only real answer to the how does Ukraine win question is that Ukraine must regain all of its territory. And we know how difficult that task is going to be. But if we see this war as being about something larger than just sovereignty and territorial integrity, if we see this as a war for democracy, if we see this as a war that Putin started because he wanted to stop Ukraine in its transition to a Western rule of law oriented democratic state that is part of the transatlantic community, then Ukraine's victory over corruption could be seen as much of a defeat for Putin as, say, the restoration of Crimea. Certainly Ukraine's ability to join Western institutions as a pluralistic rule of law democratic state, I think could be seen as much of a victory as the restoration of its 1991 frontiers, as much as that has to remain our objective as well. And one final editorial comment, if you agree with me on that, I think that is also a very powerful argument for all of us, and I know this is beyond the conversation of this conference, to support a very clear path for Ukraine to the European Union and to NATO. There's also a debate about this, certainly in the United States. Do we envision Ukraine's future as another Israel or another West Germany? Do we see it as a country that should be extremely well armed, but untethered to Western institutions? If that is how we see it, then I think there'll be less incentive actually for Ukraine to continue these reforms. Or do we see it as a country that will be part of our institutional community, in which case these reforms become essential? I think it should be the latter, but that means our leadership has to create that realistic path with a real timetable for joining these institutions. So we have a great panel, and let's start by introducing them. We're joined by my friend Ambassador Erin McKee, who is the Assistant Administrator for Europe in USAID. The severe Norm Eisen, who has been keeping us roughly on time, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, and Josh Rudolph, who is the head of malign finance and corruption at the German Marshall Fund. Josh, that is an amazing, it's a great title. I assume it means you're in charge of all the corrupt things the GMF is doing around the world, but or you can disabuse us of that. I'm going to start with Ambassador McKee with really just a basic question. Tell us a bit about what USAID is doing to promote transparency, accountability, and anti-corruption in Ukraine, and what you're doing to safeguard the larger economic assistance that the United States is providing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction and for having me here today. I need to give a little bit of context about the United States and through USAID's support for the reform agenda and anti-corruption and transparency and accountability measures. After Putin's first invasion in 2014, USAID Ukraine became our largest mission in Europe and Eurasia, and with good reason. Because we recognized that this probably was the first shot across the bow, and to strengthen and consolidate the institutions and the dedication to reform that out of the revolution of dignity that we knew were so key and why Putin invaded in the first place. And so we worked hand in glove with our partners in both the government of Ukraine, but with civil society organizations and the people of Ukraine to promote and even leapfrog and harness the amazing brain power that Ukraine has to offer, not only our partnership, but the rest of the world, in standing up the Ministry of Digital Transformation, DIA, you've heard touched on today, the award-winning ProZorro system, et cetera, because we recognize that the people needed to have that confidence and strengthened social contract with their government. Fast forward to February 2022. And we were working in a lot of other development sectors, but in terms of the undergirding good governance and reform agenda that was so key and fundamental to Ukraine's future, this was something we were firmly dedicated to advance, catalyze, and support. In 2022, the United States, USAID's mission in Ukraine had over 700 partners throughout Ukraine who did not stop working one day after February 24th. This gave us an amazing springboard to not only respond to the reinvasion, but also to ground truth and validate where needs were greatest, and continue our presence not only for relief, but to start ensuring that what we did in the investments we made in the relief space laid a foundation for ultimately recovery and reconstruction, which is what we're talking about to, the conference and what we've all been talking about the last few days. The e-governance systems, and I know that if you'll permit me for just 1 second, demonstrates the adaptability and resilience of not only the Ukrainian people, but their dedication to the reform agenda. By taking DIA that had been developed in 2019, launched just a couple of years ago, modifying the app for over 19 million Ukrainians who have access to the government services now, to be able to also record damage to feed into now the EU supported and US partnered damage registry, and ultimately will be built out and be part of the DREAM platform that we heard introduced today as well, to ensure that citizens have greater access to services, but that those citizens also have direct reporting on what their government's doing either on their behalf or where those resources are going. And so that's sort of the context and behind where we've been able to, with reassurance. And Tom, as a former member, I will tell you, I spend a lot of my time, obviously working on Ukraine and the rest of the region, but half of my time is spent up on the Hill, talking about, with the great generosity of the American taxpayer and bipartisan support through USAID alone, since February 24th, 2022, we have provided over $21 billion in humanitarian and economic support. That's unprecedented. And of course, the American people, but the Ukrainian people want to know where that money has gone and what it's been spent on. And so I'm pleased to announce that eyes wide open, with these tools that we have, both DIA as well as Prozoro and other e-governance mechanisms, as well as confidence in the institutions through which we are working, we are able to reaffirm and reassure both the American people and the Ukrainian people and the donor community that so far we are able to trace and account for those resources down to ultimate beneficiaries. You heard from our World Bank partner earlier today about how they're conducting the survey, and 90% of recipients have validated that they've received their resources and have not skipped a beat. And this is targeted to the most vulnerable members of the population: first responders, teachers, healthcare workers, and of course, and I know I'm not supposed to use this word, but I'm going to do it now in this context, pensioners. We are helping the government of Ukraine honor their commitments to their population so that that social contract that I talked about back in 2014 is strengthened and reinforced. And so I just want to give you one concrete piece of evidence as why these e-governance systems are so important. Prozoro has been confirmed to have saved the government of Ukraine $1.6 billion a year in money that had been siphoned off in the past. That's real revenue that can be put not only back into the economy, but demonstrates the commitment and their will to reform. I have a lot of other elements on oversight and sort of the transparency, accountability, and strengthening mechanisms that we've put in to ensure that this trend endures beyond just the conflict and our support and into the future. But I'll stop there in the interest of my colleagues to share their perspectives as well.
Sure, just following up on that, the reason there's sensitivity about the word pensions is that we have members of Congress in the United States who aren't convinced that the US government should be providing a safety net to the American people. And when they hear that we're paying for pensions for Ukraine, the response is not what we would want. And so it's actually very delicate how we talk about this. $21 billion is an extraordinary sum. And we're talking Marshall Plan levels of funding, unlike anything else the USAID can do around the world. So you've had generous resources, but let me just ask you, how long do you think that will last absent another congressional appropriation?
So the disbursement, and I'll put it in a couple of buckets. So through USAID, we've provided to date and will have by September almost $22 billion in direct budget support. That's the macroeconomic stability support to help the Ukrainian government continue to govern and wage a war. We've provided $1.9 billion in humanitarian assistance, and that's largely relief starting at the outbreak of the war to help internally displaced persons, as well as those that have been that have needs along the front lines and in occupied areas. And in particular, we've ramped up due to the courage and amazing resilience of the Ukrainian forces, recently liberated territories. And then we have what I would say is aid regular, and those are our regular development programs that haven't, as I said, missed a beat and are focused on critical areas, the restoration of livelihoods and recovery of the agricultural sector. We have a huge initiative there because we know that the agricultural sector isn't only important for Ukraine's GDP, but for feeding the rest of the world and global food insecurity, as well as energy security is a second priority. rule of law, local governance reform, and then social, what we would call health system strengthening, building off of, frankly, the generosity that we had under the previous administration in the response to COVID, and looking at taking that platform and upping service delivery quality as well as access to psychosocial. How are we going to keep this going? We have obligated those funds. The last disbursement of direct macroeconomic support, as I said, will be completed in September. Luckily, the EU came online this year, and they are also providing now direct budget support. But for, frankly, the majority of 2022, it was us.
Got it.
And so one of the other questions I get from Congress is, why is the U.S. the largest donor? Why are we in this alone? And I thankfully, and with everybody in this room, know that burden sharing and the ability to demonstrate what our partners are doing and what we're mobilizing and leveraging, not just from other countries and allies, but in terms of equipment, commodities, and the in-kind contributions, when you aggregate it all up, we aren't the largest and we are stronger together. And so that sustained support is something that helps us make the case. We'll see. As you said, you don't have a crystal ball. We don't know. But the more that we are able to show the commitment by the Ukrainians to not the reform agenda, but to honoring the partnerships that have responded in a way that we haven't seen in decades, helps us make the case as well.
Because nobody in the US Congress knows this. We're going to have to repeat it about 10 or 20 times, but there are actually, I think, 20 or 21 European countries that have provided more assistance to Ukraine as a percentage of national income than the United States. It's a huge, we're actually way down the list, even though the aggregate is great.
And
let me turn to Norm
Let
now.
me just add though really quickly, it's not just the EU. Let's recognize that the entire, and it's not a geographic designation, but Australia, Japan has stepped up in an amazing way. Norway, not a member of the EU, as a percentage of GDP, has leaned in amazingly. And so I think that the coalition of like-minded nations around the world recognizing the threat have stepped up, and that needs to be repeated over and over and over again.
Great. I want to turn to Norm next. Now, Norm, you and Josh just co-authored this report that everybody should have with a red cover. I've been instructed to say if you don't have it, 100 copies will be delivered to your hotel rooms with a bottle of champagne. So let us know. And of course, the QR codes we've heard about. In the report, Norm, you argue that Ukrainians are turning their anti-corruption success into in effect, a weapon of war, and using it to win what will hopefully be the peace. Say a bit more about what you mean by that.
Thanks, Tom, Ambassador, Josh, and to everybody joining us today. We've been joined by Heather Conley, the president of GMF, who will close us out later today. We know from the history of conflict and reconstruction over the past century that I alluded to earlier, that to win wars and then to sustain a meaningful peace after wars, you don't only need military victories. You have to maintain the morale, the solidarity, and the moral unity of the alliance. And Tom, you alluded to this. Putin is playing a waiting game, and he's waiting for Ukraine and particularly its allies to falter. And one of the very important ways that we need to maintain, both in the US, and it's not just on the right, there's questions about this investment both on the right and on the left in the United States Congress, from those who, whether good faith or otherwise, are focused on their own populations. And this is not unique to the United States. It is important question across the EU and in our other allies around the world. Putin is waiting us out for those cracks to appear in the alliance. One of the most important places where that vulnerability exists is around the issue of corruption, because if there are corruption scandals, if there is the perception that the money is not being well spent, it provides, whether it's an excuse or a genuine reason, to drive those wedges, to open those cracks. And we know that from the present debates, but also from the history of the conflict. That takes advantage of misperceptions of Ukraine. Yes, the challenges are great. The journey that Ukraine has been on is a relatively short one. The accomplishments, as you've heard today, the gold standards in anti-corruption forms on public beneficial ownership registry, public procurement, that's Prozoro, the database, we haven't talked about the database for politically exposed persons, the PEP issue, the asset declaration system, and on and on. The progress has been extraordinary. There's a lot to do. By pushing forward, I want to read something. Josh and I thought these were some of the most interesting and noteworthy words we heard all week long. It was from President Zelensky's address, and this goes to your question, Tom, of how the Ukrainians are turning the battle against corruption into a weapon to win the war and to win the peace. President Zelensky noted that Russia, in describing the origins of the war and why the aggression was launched and is being waged, President Zelensky noted that Russia's bosses are very afraid of our democracy, and that part of the reason the war began was because Ukraine started dismantling the old oligarchic model of economic relations from the post-Soviet period. That was a threat to Russia. And these reforms that we've heard about that reassure everyone, we had a little debate to start, I think we have to be very bold and ambitious in using these reforms and the goal of transparency and integrity as a way to rally, as President Zelensky did in his remarks, as a way to keep support strong, to rally support, to respond to those on the right, and that very ill-advised letter that was later pulled back by some of your and my friends in Congress, very good people on the left, questioning support, and to be proactive in order to maintain the strength of the alliance and the investment and the even larger investments of hundreds of billions of dollars that are going to be needed. And there are very specific things that every stakeholder, all of us in this room, in and outside of Ukraine, government, civil society, business, that all of us can do, but I'm going to leave those to others on the panel to cover. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Norm. Just one quick question. All of us, I think, agree that the progress on these issues in Ukraine has been remarkable given the amount of time, and I personally think it's sustainable given what the Ukrainian people have been through in the last couple of years. I don't think they want to go back, but I do want us to ask what the vulnerabilities still may be. And one issue I've not heard really discussed today is the role of and sustainability of an independent media in Ukraine as a central watchdog institution. This is a moment of this is an emergency. It's martial law. There is a spirit of patriotism around everything in Ukraine, including media coverage, as one would expect. We all know there's this telethon where all the different competing media entities are cooperating to present the news every night. That's understandable. But do you see any risks long-term, given how much power is centralized in the presidency, given the history of oligarch control of media, and how should we respond to that?
There's a vicious cycle that contributes to the creation of corruption, and there's a virtuous cycle that mitigates and prevents corruption, and a pluralistic, diverse media ecosystem. By the way, something that is not so simple in the United States, with in particular strong and independent investigative journalism, as notwithstanding all that we heard about today, the governmental institutions of anti-corruption, the role of civil society, having that independent investigative journalism is critical. We write about it in the report, and in particular, we encourage and USAID has been doing its part, including with an insurance program that we have set up when journalists get sued for doing investigative journalism right here in London. Those who are attempting to do investigative journalism in the region, including Ukraine, get sued because of the lenience of British libel law. And USAID actually has a risk pooling, just like the insurance risk pooling for business we're talking about, an insurance product to help protect journalists. But the EU, I hope, will meet and exceed these kinds of commitments. We write about it at length in investing more in Ukrainian investigative journalism that helps us deal with cases like the ones we were talking about earlier today, the Pivovarsky case, the Kobolyov case, which appear to many, myself included, to many friends of Ukraine, friends of the system, to be examples of business negligence, of poor decision-making, not of self-interested corruption. So we're watching those cases very closely. Independent investigative journalism acts as a brake on corruption, but perhaps a brake when the anti-corruption authorities are very occasionally too enthusiastic. And the last thing I'll say before passing back to you is one of our great American champions of working with Europe and the EU to really develop these investigative journalism modalities is our friend Ambassador Mark Gittenstein, the US ambassador to the EU, who's been an absolute visionary in driving this priority forward. Thanks, Tom.
Great. And did you want to jump in?
I did just a public service announcement. So the insurance is called Reporter Shield. And we are very proud of it because not only in London, I guess, but across Europe and Eurasia, where we see closing democratic space and increasing slap suits, and particularly against very robust and accurate investigative journalism and reporting, we want to be able to afford that protection. Just one point on our investigative journalists inside Ukraine. We have supported that effort and that work. We see it as a key pillar for anti-corruption. I will be honest in that the majority of them have pivoted since last February and are currently documenting war crimes.
Okay. Josh, we mentioned the report. Tell us your favorite recommendations. I think there are 10 or so altogether, but maybe focus on what you think the most important ones are, and whether any were accepted at the conference this week.
25, actually. 25, how much time do we have?
Okay.
No, so essentially we make this argument that Ukraine's anti-corruption success is in the vital interest of the international rules-based order. We spell out that argument for why, and because of that, we offer recommendations for what all of the major stakeholders in that order can do. And so to just, instead of 5 recommendations, I'll give you 4 types because they're spelled out here by type. First and foremost, the Ukrainians, of course, have the deepest interest in, and they have been driving their anti-corruption success for a decade. And we offer, they're the one that we offer 10 steps for. The others each have 5. But starting with the 3 that the G7 ambassadors recommended less than 2 weeks ago: constitutional court reform, turning back on asset declarations and verification and political party financing, and thirdly, NABU SAPO support. And I was happy to see support for that on the stage this week, talking about that. And then we offer what would come next after those 3 as well, for the other agencies, for anti-monopoly committee that we've talked about earlier today as well. So that's for Ukraine. For the EU, they can invest in Ukrainian investigative journalism, anti-corruption programming. We just talked about independent media, also independent television news. We have a recommendation for the EBRD because they're the best at going in and trying to rebuild markets, building out a television news market that helps migrate ownership away from the oligarchs and towards broad public ownership of the society. Great ways to spend some of the 50 billion euros that von der Leyen proposed this week. Turning to the United States, we have 5 recommendations for how they could both move the ball forward in Ukraine, things Ukrainian civil society is asking for help with, and make incremental improvements in IG coordination in the US, even if it's just codifying what they are doing, certification requirements from the State Department, essentially things that could also be helpful, frankly, domestically, helping get some of those Republican fence sitters to come on board with another supplemental appropriation bill in Ukraine. They can say, okay, now it's transparent and accountable. And then finally, the G7 donors, how they can better coordinate. And that gets to your question also about what was or was not adopted this week. It has been a mixed bag. The good news is that our recommendation number 1 for the broader donors, the agencies and the platform in the donor countries, was clearly adopted. And that's to make rebuilding aid conditional upon reforms. The biggest headline this week is the EU's 50 billion euro package to help fund recovery and reconstruction. Nobody else has done that, especially in those large numbers. That number was actually 5 times as big as all other commitments this week, and the biggest single country support program that the EU has ever done before. I checked a few news articles about it yesterday. Not one of them mentions the strategic purpose of that package that von der Leyen actually spent most of that paragraph in her speech talking about. And Gert-Jan Koopman talked about on the stage as well. And I quote, "Payments under the plan will be conditional on progress on reforms. We want to match Ukrainian reforms with European investments. Every step Ukraine takes towards us, the EU must take a step towards Ukraine. We will work with Ukraine." I mean, they said it a million different ways, which was great because, you know, as we argue in our research, and frankly, as has been demonstrated over the past decade, when a country is midway through a generational struggle to uproot oligarchy, even the most reformist government needs that outside pressure to help muscle its still sometimes in some quarters compromised political economic system into implementing voters' mandate. So that's good. The most important thing that we wanted, we got. On the other hand, this week, the donor countries did not deliver on the other 3 to 4 recommendations, which all center around how the donors themselves, like I said, the governments, the platform, the IFIs, can commit to concrete internal steps to help organize their own contribution to transparency and accountability. So it's not for thee, but not for me, like we were talking about earlier with DREAM. And I appreciated the response from Special Envoy Hilbrun. It's still a work in progress. And the EBRD pointing out, yes, and we have 170 Ukrainians here who help us with, you know, cutting edge digitalization. That's great. But other things we did not see this week that would have taken more legwork: forming a Ukrainian civil society board to advise the donors. All I heard was Denmark. They did it nationally. What about all the rest? What about the platform? And creating a fusion cell of inspectors general on site with NABU in Ukraine. No discussion of that. I mean, compared to the big financial commitments that wowed us all this week, these things would actually be easier on budgets and easier politically, but they take more bureaucratic work. So more to do in the months ahead.
a little bit off of our central topic for this panel, but it's central to everything we've discussed, and that is where's this money going to come from? If that's a fantastic commitment from the EU. It's not going to get us to $400 billion if that's the total. The U.S. Congress, we hope, will appropriate more money for assistance to Ukraine, but you should not expect major support for reconstruction funded by the U.S. taxpayer. And that brings us back to this question of alternative sources of funding, including seized assets. I got the first bill on this through the United States Congress, at least enabling the Biden administration to spend any seized assets directly to support reconstruction in Ukraine. But we are now down to the very complicated question of how to actually facilitate the seizure of those assets in a way that's consistent with our own commitment to the rule of law. And I would invite anybody to offer any thoughts. Erin?
I just want to build on that and respond a little bit to a couple of points that Josh raised. So external funding, private sector, Russian assets, Russia certainly needs to be held accountable for not only the crimes they've committed, but the devastation they've waged on the country. But our first incoming proposition has been, since day one, is to help wherever we can, and this circles back to the agricultural sector that has been a priority for us, is to help Ukraine accelerate its path to economic recovery and generate revenue so that their dependency on external resources to both, on direct budget support, macroeconomic support is reduced. That's pivotal. It's insufficient to rebuild the country, but it's a critical building block. And so that has been a top priority of theirs and ours. On your point, Josh, about the various sort of IGs plugging in, where are we on oversight, et cetera, there is wholesale commitment. The challenge, and I just wanted to put this out there, is that every nation, individually, bilaterally, even the member states of the EU, but from all of the donors, we all have different systems for budget, for oversight, that with different levels of authority and access to them. So having a unified donor embed, for example, in NABU or SAPO, is tricky, right? And sort of who's going to take the lead. We're not there yet. We recognize the need, but we also can't wait until this community of nations, which is amazing, sort of figures that out. And so I think that the transparency, oversight, accountability that we need for our own constituents to foot stomp and hopefully continue to reduce those fissures and keep the resource flows to the best of our ability coming, we need to continue to move forward.
Josh, Norm, asset recovery, anything?
I'll add two notes on asset recovery. I'll recognize Tom's work in Congress, where his legislation to allow, consistent with our US legal authorities, assets seized from Russian oligarchs to be used for reconstruction once they are lawfully seized, was really historic. We got it through both houses of Congress, signed by the president. And it's one of the few, Congress does not like to give up. I've worked there. They do not like to give up their appropriation power. It's very rarely done. This was an extremely unusual example, and it's a good precedent. This is not the only paper Josh and I have worked on, and for a thoughtful analysis of these issues as they cross-cut jurisdiction. Our co-author in our paper we wrote before the Ukraine Reconstruction Conference, Thomas Klein-Abrakov, he really was the leader of driving this paper through. He was a merciless taskmaster for me and Josh and the other authors. And we have a big section in this paper on how to invest Russia's frozen public funds, the debate in the different jurisdictions on the legal authorities, because we want to be certainly forward-leaning, but we want to model the rule of law adherence that Putin has breached. So how do you do that in rule of law systems? We recommend, among other things, an international claims commission for Ukraine, and we reflect the debate. There's a hot debate to be had about how far you can go. So that is my answer.
Well, the debate is there because there is a legitimate fear of setting a precedent that will scare sovereign wealth funds from around the world from investing in the dollar or the euro, and I understand that. So I think the question is, how do you circumscribe the precedent? In U.S. law, there is an exception to the rule already. The rule that says you can't seize sovereign assets, and the exception is if a country makes war on the United States, they forfeit their assets in the United States. I think maybe one idea worth exploring here is to create one additional exception, and that is for countries that have been deemed by an international tribunal to have been guilty of the crime of aggression, which is very close to the exception that currently exists in US law. And since there does seem to be serious support for such a tribunal, including among Republicans in the US Congress, amazingly, that may be a viable way out. I'll make maybe one more provocative point here, and that is, I think there are actually two morally justified ways of paying for this. One is to make Russia pay. The other is to encourage those who have profited from the war to pay. There are a couple of countries in the Persian Gulf that, when all is said and done, will have probably earned about $400 billion extra dollars from higher energy prices, which they have artificially kept high through some of their choices. And I think personally, it's a bit shameful that our respective leaders have not done enough to shame them over this. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have provided literally pennies in support to Ukraine, even as they have earned tens of billions of dollars off of this war, and we shouldn't forget that. Do we have time for questions?
We have time for one round of questions. Take all the questions, and then we'll do very brisk answers.
Very good. So let's start over here.
Short questions, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Marisa Lutsevich, the head of Ukraine Forum at Chatham House. Excellent discussion to wrap up the week. I would like to ask Erin, what is your vision for strengthening Ukraine democracy post-war? Are you strategizing about it? Do you think it's too early? And another question, there's a keyword security here in this panel, not just integrity and transparency. And I think, from our conversation with investors and at our side event on the 20th of June, there was a lot of concern about creating a security shield, not just a media shield, over Ukraine so that investors can come. The Vilnius summit is coming. The Ukraine's pathway to victory is both ways. One is recovery now, and it's a sure road to NATO membership now. Can you share anything with us on that front? Thanks.
Question over here.
Thank you. I'll have questions, but also a couple of comments from the Great White North just above the US, so if you allow me. Martin Tabi from Ministry of Finance in Canada. Well, certainly we'll start with your last comment. We'll agree with you, so thanks for being provocative and honest. You also at the beginning were blunt and honest about the political landscape and a potential shift bringing corruption from outside of Ukraine, and I'll put the political dimension aside, and thanks for recognizing that, because even if we're putting political dimension aside, corruption, and I think Greta was mentioning it, nobody is like scoring 100%, so feel like we're talking about corruption in Ukraine, but Ukrainians will be also vulnerable to corruptions coming from outside. And I'll broaden this with throwing also anti-money laundering measures, which will be important to protect Ukrainians as well, because organized crime has no border, and that's going to be also, they will also see, like the private sector who's playing by the rules, all the great opportunities that are going to be arising from a peaceful time that will come as soon as possible, let's hope. So that's going to be important to take that into account in the context of rebuilding. So that's the criminal aspect. confirming that the strong judicial system will be essential, but also more regular conflict in contract will be important. And that's what we heard from our own Canadian business representatives that were attending this week. Just getting paid, being able to go to court to resolve simple conflicts will be important as well. So let's not lose track of the regular stuff as well, which we will require. So, and that's a question that we were all facing this week. What's the point of de-risking? And I'm all for the UK initiative, and we're looking into that if you cannot resolve conflicts. So that's going to be very important. Just want to, if you allow me to finish. Thanks for raising the per capita. It's important. Canada being the size of one state in the US, I picked conveniently California. We're amongst the top in terms of per capita budget support. And also on asset seizure and forfeiture, our legislation is in place. One thing that is going to be super important is taking the time to have a solid couple of first cases going through court, because if we're failing with the first few cases, then that's the long road ahead, and we need to be extra careful about that. So we have our legislation, but we need to be successful in the first few cases.
Great,
Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to take more, but I've been threatened with conscription into the Wagner group if I do.
They do
so-
need improvement.
Well, thank you. So why don't we just do, anybody who wants to reply to any of those, please do so briefly.
Yeah, sure. So on having to protect from corruption coming in from the outside, absolutely super important. I think the specialized anti-corruption agencies are well equipped when you get to that point of accountability. Obviously, you prefer to avoid getting to that point and have it be prevented from the beginning. And there, the best thing to do is, as we discussed earlier, have the donors insist on using DREAM, not only integrating it into their own systems, but requiring their implementing partners to do that, mirroring what the Ukrainians are going to be doing by requiring it of everyone on the Ukrainian side, and then everyone seeing everything end to end, and that significantly reduces the opportunities for corruption. And then I really take Ambassador McKee's point about, and I should have clarified, the IGs are doing excellent work coordinating. Some months ago, I was of the view that we need, the focus and the salience of something like, a special, a CGAR type like we had before. I have changed my mind about that. And the reason is I saw the terrific hearings that the House Foreign Affairs Committee put on. And I saw these reports that the IGs have organized, and they've self-organized into this interagency coordinating group. They're reporting to Congress. They're doing their work really well. And so one of the things, though, that they have said in their reports and in Congress is the importance of getting in early, getting into the country early. And they've specifically, if you look at the reports and look at what they see as the greatest risks, they talk about US tax dollars going into multilaterals and where it gets mixed into multi-country funds, and how they specifically call out the World Bank and UN agencies, and how it kind of goes into a black hole that then the IGs here don't want US IGs looking into. All the more reason to get them all into the same room so they can start deepening those relationships, because most of the time donors kind of want to keep those matters of risks to themselves rather than sharing. So have to start socializing that. I could talk about Russian assets, but I know we're running out of time.
Yes. Erin, very quickly.
So very quickly to your question on what we're looking at in terms of democracy and good governance. As you know, this is President Biden's top priority, and on his fourth day in office, he signed the executive order to combat corruption. And so, this has been our marching orders even before the invasion. The way we're tackling it is actually through the relief to recovery to restoration process, by ensuring that the institutions of government that we are supporting at the national level and the delivery of assistance and ultimately reconstruction support at the local level are, there's no zero daylight, and that the systems, e-governance and other areas are strengthened to ensure that the people of the country have access to their government, access to their services, confidence in the delivery, and that there are no governance gaps. And so through our decentralization work, and as we execute on the ground today and not waiting to create that muscle memory and that DNA, we are wholly committed and recognize that it needs to be both top down and bottom up. Really quickly on security, I can't speak to the NATO accession, which we of course absolutely support. But in terms of, and our Department of Defense, and certainly bipartisan support on the part of Congress, the military assistance is an easier sell than the long-term development and sort of macroeconomic assistance. But I would say that the security environment and stability is not just physical security and military security. It's a complex security environment. We saw the impact globally on pandemic. So we are weaving in and addressing energy security through the Energy Diversity and Strengthening Program, climate security by ensuring that there's a green future. We heard a lot about over the last few days. Health security and food security, not just food security and better productivity for Ukraine in the future for itself again, but for the rest of the world. So that is the way that we are laser focused on ensuring that security, which is complex and multifaceted, is tackled not just from the military side.
Thank you all. If I could answer the NATO question, it would be NATO membership for Ukraine should depend solely on factors that are under Ukraine's control and not on whether Russia is still shooting at Ukrainians. And I'm afraid we're not quite there yet for the Vilnius summit. Norm, take it away.